You know Iran is about to fall when the money stops working. There is a moment in every failing society when people stop arguing about politics and start arguing about money. Not interest rates, not policy, cold, hard cash. Whether it's still there, whether it's still real, whether it will still be worth anything tomorrow. Iran has now crossed that line. Not metaphorically, literally. People lined up outside banks not to invest, not to borrow, not to speculate, but to withdraw whatever they could while they still could. ATMs emptied, withdrawal limits tightened, banks issued reassurances that convinced absolutely no one. Money didn't disappear all at once, it thinned, became harder to access, harder to trust. And once trust breaks, money stops being money. It becomes a countdown to the end. But what is happening inside Iran right now goes far beyond mere economic turmoil. It is a violent nationwide breakdown, and the state is responding the way governments respond when they believe they are losing control. People are being shot in the streets, hospitals are being overwhelmed, banks are being drained, the internet is being completely shut down, satellite connections are being hunted down, and the government is no longer pretending this is temporary. This is not de-escalation. This is a regime acting as if time itself has turned against it. Protests that began over prices and economic instability have spread across multiple cities. Security forces are using live fire. Conservative accounts suggest that anywhere from hundreds to thousands of people have been killed. Tens of thousands are arrested, and the country has been pushed into near total internet blackout. Reuters reports roughly 490 protesters killed, 48 security personnel dead, and more than 10,600 arrests. But those figures are considered conservative because communication blackouts make it incredibly difficult to verify these numbers, but reports coming from inside the country suggest even higher casualties in several major cities. The blackout itself is part of the response. As protests intensified, mobile networks and fixed internet connections were cut. NetBlocks reported a nationwide outage coinciding with evening demonstrations. Videos now emerge sporadically, short clips, delayed uploads, fragments sent through VPNs or satellite Starlink connections. What is visible shows a pattern. Incredibly large crowds, gunfire, bodies in the streets, overwhelmed hospitals. This is not a localized incident. It is nationwide. Now, yes, the immediate trigger was economic. Iran's currency hit new lows in early January. Iran International reported the rial was trading for around 1.47 million rial to $1 US, a level that sharply raises the cost of imports, food, and medicine. At the same time, the government moved to reduce or halt subsidized access to dollars, a step that directly feeds into price spikes. When importers lose access to cheap foreign currency, costs are passed through immediately. Prices did not rise gradually. They completely jumped. For many households, that shift was the breaking point. Wages did not adjust. Savings lost value incredibly quickly. Basic goods became completely unstable in price and availability. That is when protests began, not as an ideological movement, but as a response to economic shock. But once protesters started, they did not remain confined to economic demands. Crowds grew, demonstrations spread to multiple cities, slogans shifted from prices to the regime itself. At the same time, behavior off the streets changed. People began pulling cash from banks. Businesses hesitated to price inventory because the prices were fluctuating so quickly. Families rushed to convert savings into dollars, gold, or goods. When a currency loses credibility, people stop behaving within the bounds of society and start behaving defensively to prepare for worst-case scenarios. That shift accelerates instability far faster than protests alone. Governments can suppress mere demonstrations, but they struggle to suppress sheer panic. As is always the case with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the state's response was immediately forceful. Security forces were deployed across cities, live ammunition was used early, eyewitness accounts described firing into crowds rather than crowd dispersal. Iran International reported footage showing bodies in body bags and multiple fatalities at single sites, just complete mass murders. Hospitals receiving large numbers of casualties, with some facilities completely overwhelmed and having no place to store these bodies. Doctors and hospital workers told reporters that morgues filled incredibly quickly. In at least one case, bodies were stacked in an auxiliary room due to lack of space. Arrests were mass and preemptive. Reuters reports more than 10,600 detained individuals. Families report that many arrests carry the risk of capital charges under Iran's laws against enmity against God. The message from the state was unambiguous. Participation would be punished severely. Now, as force escalated, the internet went dark. The blackout served two purposes. First, it limited coordination among protesters because protests are harder to scale when people cannot share locations, videos, or schedules. Second, it limited visibility. Fewer images reach the outside world. Casualty counts become harder to verify. The narrative becomes easier to control. But the blackout also created a secondary effect: fear. When people cannot see what is happening elsewhere, they assume the worst. Rumors spread faster than facts, and panic deepens. That is why the blackouts has been aggressively enforced. Now, there is some use of Starlink and some satellite internet connections, which have become a focal point. There are an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 Starlink terminals inside of Iran. In a country of over 90 million people, that is very limited coverage. But during a blackout, even limited connectivity matters. Authorities are now treating satellite internet as a security threat. Possession of unauthorized satellite equipment is no longer treated as a technical violation. It is treated as a national security offense. During blackouts, active Wi-Fi signals stand out. Locations can be identified. Checkpoints have increased to search for individuals who have this technology. Reports indicate that people using Starlink are being targeted. As a result, fewer videos are emerging compared to the first days of unrest. What does come out, however, shows continued large crowds taking to the streets. The footage that we are seeing shows recent clips from Tehran and other cities where protesters are using mobile phone lights after authorities cut electricity to certain streets. Crowds continue to chant anti-government slogans. Crowds are also calling for America and Israel to come in and liberate the people of Iran. Numbers do not appear to be shrinking in the streets. As of this month, January 2026, widespread revolutionary unrest is occurring across all 31 provinces of Iran, with the estimates for the number of participants and their representation of the total population varying by source. Several reports indicate that millions of Iranians have taken to the streets in the last few weeks, and protests have been documented in at least 186 cities and towns at over 585 locations. Iran's population in 2026 is estimated approximately at 92.8 million. While active street protesters are only a fraction of that population, independent surveys indicate that 70 to 80% of the Iranian public oppose the current regime, which suggests that the movement has broad ideological support far beyond those physically present in the streets. Additional groups are also entering the picture. Iranian, Azerbaijani, Turkish political organizations issued statements calling on their communities to join the protest. Azerbaijani Turks represent one of the largest ethnic groups in Iran. Kurdish groups, including the Kurdish Freedom Party, known as PAK or PAK, have taken credit for attacks on IRGC positions. These PAK fighters have experience from fighting ISIS in Syria and have previously coordinated with U.S. forces. Their numbers are limited, but their involvement marks an escalation. These developments suggest the unrest is no longer purely spontaneous or localized. There is also a major shift inside Iran in the language used by state-run media. Initially, protesters were described as rioters, but they are being labeled now as armed terrorists. That change matters. Labeling protesters as terrorists reframes the crackdown. It provides justification for lethal force and broader arrests. It prepares the public for continued violence. State television has broadcast messages warning parents not to let their children go out, stating that if the children are harmed or killed, families should not complain to authorities afterwards, and the state will not be responsible for their death. That is not a message of de-escalation. It is efforts to deter protesters through fear. If you think about all of this compared to the most recent protests in Iran, the closest comparison was November of 2019. And during protests that year, around 1,500 people were killed as the government crushed demonstrations over fuel prices. That event became known as Bloody November. Current casualty estimates, even conservative ones, approach or exceed that figure in a much shorter time frame. That alone explains the level of alarm. Authoritarian governments like Iran do not exceed their own historical violence thresholds unless they believe the threat is existential. And the unrest is now intersecting with international pressure. Donald Trump stated that Iran is looking at freedom perhaps like never before, and that the US stands ready to help those protesters. He also said that he would speak with Elon Musk about restoring internet access in Iran. This is, of course, a power play against the Iranian regime, because if they can restore internet access for the protesters, then that means that the Islamic Republic of Iran as a government will lose control over the narrative of what's happening inside of their country, and the protesters will regain their voice in the international community. Separately, the Wall Street Journal reported that the administration has begun preliminary discussions on potential military actions, including aerial strikes on Iranian targets, in response to this crackdown. Now, Trump indicated that they are willing to negotiate with the Islamic Republic, and they've set up meetings to talk with the leaders in Iran, but he also explained that the U.S. might strike or take military action before those meetings even come to pass. The New York Times reported that Trump has been briefed on a range of strike options tied to Iran's security services, though military commanders have indicated they would want more time. There is no confirmation yet of imminent action, but there is clear signaling that Trump is standing with protesters. Some tips that the U.S. military action may be imminent include the following. Iran's foreign minister abruptly cut short a trip to Lebanon and returned to Tehran. No official explanation was given, and in context of ongoing unrest, schedule changes at that level are notable. At the same time, U.S. strikes on ISIS targets in Syria were carried out, reportedly in response to earlier attacks on American personnel, but the assets used for that remain positioned in the region. Taken together, these developments increase pressure on Tehran during an internal crisis. But where do things currently stand? Iran is facing three simultaneous problems. 1. Economic instability that triggered unrest. 2. Nationwide protests that continue despite lethal force. And 3. An information battle over visibility and narrative. Now, the state has responded to those threats with live fire, mass arrests, and near total internet blackout. But that state response has not ended the protests. Crowds remain large. New groups are joining. The death toll continues to rise. This is not a contained situation. It is a rapidly evolving one. For years, Iran's economy limped forward under pressure. Inflation rose. The currency weakened. Sanctions tightened. None of that was new. People adjusted because they had to. But something now has changed. And when it changed, it happened fast. But why are the protests in Iran different this time than they were in prior years? Iran has seen protests before. Large ones, violent ones, deadly ones. What makes this moment different is not the existence of unrest, but how people and parts of the system are behaving inside of it. First, protesters are no longer hiding their identity in fear of being persecuted by the regime. Videos and eyewitness accounts show people demonstrating openly, using their real names, showing their real faces, and calling directly for outside attention. In previous protest cycles, anonymity was the norm. Faces were blurred, names were withheld, participation was cautious and episodic. That caution appears to be eroding. Reports from inside Iran indicate that many protesters no longer believe that staying invisible improves their chances of survival. Instead, visibility is being treated as protection. The belief that being seen and documented and known may be safer than disappearing quietly. That is a psychological shift, not just a tactical one. Essentially, the people are at the end of the road here. They don't feel like they have any other alternative. They feel like they're probably going to die either way, so they might as well die fighting for their freedom. Second, economic stress is no longer limited to civilians. Reports from the ground indicate delays in salary payments to the government's security personnel, including lower-level police and auxiliary forces. While these reports are difficult to independently verify under blackout conditions, similar payment delays have been documented in past Iranian crises and are consistent with the broader fiscal strain currently visible in state finances. When security personnel are not paid on time, their discipline and motivation weakens. Loyalty becomes transactional. Compliance becomes uneven. That is a key pressure point that could very well lead security personnel to defect very soon, or it may at least cause them to hesitate before taking certain orders, which is on its own very destabilizing. Even mere hesitation matters in a system that relies on fast, unquestioned enforcement. But although there is no verified evidence of mass defections inside the Revolutionary Guard or police, there are reports by former Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, that they are starting to see much more than mere hesitation by some of these security personnel. Reza Pahlavi is a key figure in these protests as the son of the most recent Shah of Iran, who used to be in power before the Islamic Republic took over in the revolution of 1979. Reza Pahlavi has been in exile, but has always encouraged Iranians to rise up and take back their freedom by overthrowing the current tyrannical regime. The protesters are calling for Reza to be reinstated to lead Iran in a transitional government, which Reza has pledged to do in order to facilitate democratic elections. In recent media appearances, he argued that the regime's real weakness is internal collapse from within the government rather than street clashes alone. On Fox News, Pahlavi said that while there have been no mass formal defections, thousands of security personnel are quietly opting out, calling in sick, failing to report for duty, or finding excuses to avoid being deployed because they do not want to be responsible for shooting and mowing down unarmed civilian protesters. According to Pahlavi, this silent non-compliance is eroding the regime's ability to carry out sustained crackdowns even without dramatic mass defections. Third, protesters are no longer isolated by geography or class. Footage and reports show participation across multiple cities, multiple neighborhoods, and multiple demographic groups. This is not confined to students, not confined to one ethnic group, and not confined to one economic class. In previous uprisings, unrest could be segmented and suppressed locally. This time, despite the blackout, the pattern appears broader and more synchronized. Fourth, the state is escalating faster than it has in past cycles. The speed with which live fire was used, the scale of arrests, the rapid shift in language from rioters to terrorists, and the immediacy of the internet shutdown all point to a government acting preemptively rather than reactively. That suggests the regime views the unrest not as manageable dissent, but as a systemic threat. Finally, the economic context is worse than in prior protest waves. In 2019, protests followed a sharp fuel price increase. The trigger was sudden, but the broader economy still functioned. Today, the currency is at a record low. Prices are unstable across basic goods, and confidence in banks and wages has completely deteriorated. This is not a single policy shock. It is a cumulative government-wide failure. Taken together, these factors explain the intensity of the response. People are more visible. Economic pressure extends into the security forces. Protests are broader and harder to isolate. The state is escalating earlier, and the economy is providing no relief valve. That combination has not existed in this form before, and it is why we might be seeing the end of the Islamic Republic as we know it in the very near future. I'll be covering much more about these Iranian protests and also about global power shifts and breaking developments every Tuesday and Thursday on this channel. And on Sundays, I'll post my longer form standard videos on AI, power, and authority, how control is changing, and who's actually gaining leverage in the global stratosphere. If you want to follow how power is moving in real time, subscribe and follow along. And if this video was useful, you need to watch this next one over here. It breaks down how the America First narrative is quietly undermining America's own interests, especially when it comes to the US aid that is given to Israel. I'll see you all there.